Hi everyone and welcome to this video. I'm going to be discussing our Ken Waltz reading where he was talking about nuclear deterrence. Remember, the context for this is that we're seeing quite a lot now of countries, a lot of countries that are potentially, probably, working on obtaining their own nuclear deterrent. We have, of course, North Korea, who I think have tested nuclear weapons already. And then we have Iran as well. These are particularly problematic, I think, because they're enemies of the United States, right? They're probably non-status quo countries, revisionist countries, and they seem to us certainly, right, to pose a great threat to the international system. We talked a little bit about China, who of course have had them nuclear weapons for decades. We also talked about them as a potential competitor or a potential revisionist power in the world. But certainly, we debated whether or not China are. We could do the same for Iran and for North Korea, but that's not what we're doing. What we're really doing, right, is in that context, if Iran, let's say, were to develop a nuclear deterrent, what would that mean? Would that mean a less stable world? Would that mean a greater likelihood of war and of conflict between the United States and Iran, Israel and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran? Is this going to lead to war or destabilization of the region, or stabilization? And Ken Waltz, for me, the interesting thing for Ken Waltz, right, is he wants to argue that actually nuclear deterrence leads to greater stability, as it did for him during the Cold War. So that's sort of the context and the basis of what we're doing. And now let me turn to your questions. And this first one was an interesting one. It was quite a good one. It opens up a few different avenues of inquiry, and so we'll take one or two of them at least. So it says this. This was the most upvoted one as well. Nuclear weapons dissuade states from going to war more surely than conventional weapons do. So they dissuade states from going to war more surely than conventional weapons do. Okay, and so here it comes. Waltz wrote this paper in the 1990s, before 9/11 and the war on terror. I was going to say it, but the questioner already says it. That seems to have fundamentally changed the nature of warfare yet again. Right? Where are we now? Like, what does Ken Waltz have to say about Al Qaeda, right, or ISIS? And the truth is nothing. Certainly not in this article. Yeah, so if the nature, so let's carry on with the question. In an era of non-state actors and fighting for causes beyond state sovereignty, how might Waltz rationalize the increase in war between non-nuclear entities and nuclear superpowers? Are these terrorist attacks part of the prolonged peace? Because it's not superpowers going to war, because it's not superpowers going to war against each other for world domination. So I see like a multitude of things going on here, and so let me sort of deal with them bit by bit. First of all, I sort of dealt with one that yes, this is different, and I think the fact that warfare has been fundamentally changed might lend some credence to Ken Waltz's argument. Ken Waltz is definitely talking about states here, right? He's talking in the 1990s. I think it's published in 1990, right? He's writing then. He's writing about the Cold War. He's writing specifically about the relationship between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. He has things in there about world domination, which he doesn't think the Soviet Union is trying for world domination, but clearly that's the narrative in which he is trying to intervene. So. Yeah, he's talking about a world that maybe doesn't exist anymore. Certainly, great superpower rivalry. China to one side, we already discussed China, but that rivalry maybe doesn't exist anymore. Maybe I shouldn't be so hasty to put that relationship between the United States and China aside, because we did talk about it in the class. If we're worried about a future competition, right, between China and the United States, and is it going to be stormy, right? Is it going to be unstable? Then Ken Waltz tells us here no, and that's what we would learn perhaps from the Cold War, both being nuclear armed. And if there's any worry about, well, China doesn't seem to have as many nuclear warheads as the United States, so wouldn't the United States be tempted to use them? Ken Waltz deals directly with that. That's one of the elements of deterrence that he thinks people have misunderstood. And when I say people, I mean senior policy makers have misunderstood that actually you don't need to have more nuclear weapons than the other guy. You only need to have enough that they, it's not even about numbers, right? It's about survivability. So if you have a second strike, right, as soon as you have a second strike capability, you have enough nuclear weapons. That's how many you need. And the second strike capability, just to be clear, right, is that let's take China and the United States. Should China be attacked by the United States in a nuclear attack, right, obviously very, for reasons that Waltz goes into, very unlikely scenario, but should they be attacked, and should the United States try and use their weapons to knock out Chinese nuclear capabilities, will enough of their missiles survive to deal a blow to the United States that would be so costly that it would make the United States having a first attack unthinkable? And the answer is yes. And the answer is yes for lots and lots of countries. Well, for all nuclear armed countries. And we don't know as much about Israel, at least I don't know as much about Israel, and certainly they're secretive about it. And I don't even know if they admit that they have nuclear weapons, but certainly it's common knowledge that they do. Common knowledge, right, but not privileged knowledge or anything. So that's enough nuclear weapons. So we wouldn't have to worry about that. I've gone into a little bit early into deterrence. But if we're talking about fundamentally changed the nature of warfare, so if we're talking about China and the United States and we're worried about conflict or war between them, Ken Waltz says, let's not worry, they're both nuclear armed. Okay, that's not really what we're talking about anymore. What we're really talking about, again, is Iran, right? Is should other countries, should you and I worry if other countries start to obtain nuclear weapons? Should Israel worry, right? Should Israel worry if Iran were to get nuclear weapons? They've made statements, very foolish statements, Ahmadinejad, especially while he was the prime minister there. Is it the president there, actually? Because you have the supreme leader at the top, and then you have a guy that serves under him, which was Ahmadinejad at one point. But so he made crazy statements, right? Crazy statements about, you know, and Iran often does this, right? We're going to push Israel into the sea and all of that. We're going to annihilate Israel. Very alarming statements and very and crazy statements. And they're crazy for a number of reasons, right? But one of the reasons that they're crazy is that if we agree with Ken Waltz, there's no way, right? There's no way that they would try to do that. Ken Waltz says it in the reading, right? Oftentimes when there's a conflict, states have every incentive, right, to threaten big punishments, right? It's like anybody, when we get into a fight, it's in our interest, right, to make it sound as bad as we can for the other person. That is within our interest, but to try and follow through on that on a nuclear armed country is crazy. And what Walt says is, like, people he hasn't known any world leaders that don't want to stay in power. I think he says oh, look, accept a few handful of democratic countries, but you know, people want to stay in power once they're in power. And so however crazy they might be, right, North Korea, however crazy you might think, ultimately they want to hang on to power, and the way to not hang on to power is to get yourself annihilated or get yourself removed, right, by your generals, because your generals realize that what you're about to do, let's say launch an attack on Japan, a nuclear attack on Japan, they realize that is not going to end well for North Korea. And so the generals say, look, you know, we also want to stay in charge, and we have some power to make a difference here, right? We can get rid of this guy, we can arrest him, we can replace him with somebody else, we can have a coup. Not just military leaders, it depends on the country, right? Sometimes military leaders, sometimes other civilian powerful people in the country. Nobody wants to go down with somebody who's acting irrationally, right? And so this is another argument I think that I'm getting from Ken Waltz. I want to come back to the focus. So again, we're talking about Iran now. We're talking about, is it And so what we're doing now is we're sort of covering the argument of, well, what if, yeah, it's okay for the United States to have it. Yeah, it's okay for the Soviet Union. They're rational actors. Yes, it's okay for China to act. They're responsible. Of course, that wasn't always the view of China, right, in the West. Yeah, they're rational. They can have it. Yes, Britain and France, they wouldn't do anything too bad. Britain's an interesting case in terms of deterrent and in terms of second strike capability, because they have a fairly limited number compared to the United States and the Soviet or Russia. They have a fairly limited number of warheads, but they're submarine based, right? Which obviously some of the US deterrent is as well, submarine based. Submarine based nuclear weapons are smart, right? Because you don't usually know where the submarine is at any point. The British have at least one submarine out at all times in the sea, ready to, with the in order to have a second strike capability. If there's any, and there aren't in the UK, but if there were any land-based nuclear missiles in the UK that that you could destroy, well, you're not going to get every single submarine that's out there, and that's the same. That's what Ken Waltz also says that about the United States. We have land-based; they might be vulnerable, but they're only vulnerable. The only way that would make these land-based missiles vulnerable in the United States is if a country forgot about the fact that there's bunches of submarines out there also with nuclear warheads attached to missiles. That if we took out, even if we thought we could take out every single land-based one, well, at this point now we're in big trouble, right? Because we're going to get hit probably, almost certainly. So, and the price that we're going to pay is vastly outweighs any benefit we would get from destroying land-based nuclear weapons in the United States. So this is I'm sort of keep pushing into the idea of deterrence, but the real question here is, let me get back to it. It's in the era of non-state actors and fighting for causes beyond state sovereignty. How might Waltz rationalize the increase in war between non-nuclear entities and nuclear superpowers? And a direct point to that is, hey, the fact that the nature of war has fundamentally changed is in some ways a bolster to Walt's answer, to Walt's argument, because if we look back into the 20th century and the 19th century and we see the wars that took place, a lot of wars in Europe. Think of the First World War and the Second World War, obviously across the world as well, not just in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. A lot of large-scale wars, and in particular World War I and World War II, where society by that point had advanced to such a point where industrialized war was happening, right? Massive production of munitions, massive production or marshalling of manpower on massive scales, hugely destructive. World War I and then World War II, hugely destructive. Since World War II, I would argue we haven't had a war like that. There's been nothing that comes. Have a look. I've been looking recently because we've been talking about the coronavirus, right? We've been talking about the coronavirus in terms of how many casualties, how many deaths. We've been talking about sort of on a war footing. And so I tried to compare it. Okay, how many people have died from the coronavirus up to now? How many people died in wars? And I started looking at the figures, and the figures for the first night were astronomical figures. I mean, incredible numbers of deaths. So, however many people have died in the war on terror, and of course every death is a personal tragedy, but looking at comparing those types of warfare, if we like, and the change in nature from one type of war to another type of war, that seems remarkable, and almost certainly, right? I was going to say probably a good thing, but almost certainly a good thing. While we recognize, right, that terrorism and guerrilla warfare, which I speak about in another class actually, guerrilla warfare and terrorism that are, they're deadly, they are something to be combated, right? Something to be resolved, a problem to be resolved, absolutely. But it is, you're very right, it is a very different problem from the sort of large-scale superpower nuclear strategic thinking. There was an attempt, and maybe it still goes on. I haven't thought about this too much for a while, this connection, but there is a connection, or rather the United States tried to make a connection between those two things. In the early days, right, in the invasion of Afghanistan. The invasion of Afghanistan was, yes, to go and get the Taliban, right, and where some of the training camps and that sort of thing were based, and that the Taliban were hosting. Absolutely. But it had another purpose, right? The strategic purpose is to connect these, to connect Al-Qaeda in this case, right? But to connect these sort of terrorist groups to a state, right? And to a sovereign, right? To take the words from your question there. Because that way it's easier to hold that state accountable, right? If you have terrorists operating on your territory, it's difficult for the United States to go everywhere in the world and sort of deal with anybody that might hold any ill will towards the United States. But what they could do is they can hold individual states responsible for anybody that's acting on their territory that's harboring ill will, not just harboring ill will, but the intent and the capability to act on that ill will against the United States. And so if we say to the government of Afghanistan, hey, if you don't deal with this, it's your neck's on the line, right? Or to Iraq, or although Iraq, it's a much more difficult connection to make. But to Iran, right? To say to Iran, look, you're responsible for Hezbollah. If what they do, you're doing it. And so if we can't get them because they're sort of melt into the shadows and they're a little bit, they don't wear uniforms and they don't go on parades, and I actually do those things. But maybe it's harder for us to strike at a terrorist organization that doesn't have any land. But you guys have land, you have territory, right? You have sovereignty. We can come after you, and that connection there is one strategy that the United States is using. And then to get back to nuclear weapons, then I suppose that, and this has taken me a little bit further along a road than I'd be fully comfortable with. But at that point, it does become somewhat possible to use nuclear. And I'll tell you why it's not a great argument in a second, but why it could be possible to use a nuclear deterrent against terrorists and that sort of thing by connecting them with a particular nation state, and then by saying, look, they're acting on your behalf, they're acting with your blessing, and so we take an act from them as if it were an act from you. Now, the reason why we shouldn't go too far along there, the reason why it becomes uncomfortable, is this. For Ken Waltz, right? Ken Waltz says this: look, we don't threaten nuclear conflict over every little thing, right? We don't do that. That's silly, right? We would temper the price a little bit depending on what the action is that our enemy takes. But actually, like, Ken Waltz does say this. He does say that okay, we're not going to have an all-out nuclear attack on the Soviet Union if they invade Germany, West Germany, right? Yeah, well, we're not going to do that, but we might concentrate some nuclear weapons, some nuclear attack on one particular industrial area, right? As a message to say, look, hey, we still have these are still very destructive, and what you're doing is unacceptable. Just a small message, right? This is unacceptable to us. The argument that he anticipates from that is people say, no, you can't do that. Once you launch one nuclear weapon, once you start a nuclear attack, even if it's a very limited one like that, now you should expect absolute retaliation that's going to destroy cities, right? And Ken Waltz denies that. He says, no, that won't happen. If we were to make it clear that that this is a very limited attack, this is all we're doing. Now, of course, it becomes very difficult to manage that, right? To manage expectations and to convey intentions. But I suppose, if the Soviets can verify that, right? They can say, okay, how many missiles have we got? What's that trajectory? Where they're heading? Okay, they're headed there. To this one particular area. There aren't any more. We can see that there's no more coming. I'm imagining, I don't know if anybody's seen, I hope you have seen Dr. Strangelove. I'm imagining the big board where they're watching on the big board and coming across there. But anyway, in that scenario, Ken Waltz thinks that might be a use of the nuclear deterrent, right? To say, look, you invaded. And so then, if we if there was a terrorist or guerrilla attack on the United States that was equivalent, right, to the Soviet Union invading Germany, right, of equivalent scale, maybe 9/11, right, then maybe there's a, for Ken Waltz, right, there's certainly a case then for a targeted nuclear attack. Now, that's not what we did, right? So what we did instead was a conventional attack. And Ken Waltz says, and he's talking long before these things happen, sometimes there's value in that, like in listening to what they were saying like 30 years ago and seeing, okay, like, is there any application? Would that have worked? Should we be following this advice now? How long is this advice good for? But so Ken Waltz says, look, nuclear attack will be better. He says the thing with conventional forces, right? The thing with defense. So we've got deterrence and defense, which are two different things. And Ken Waltz explains that in the reading. Deterrence is, hey, you're not even going to attack me because if you do, it'll cost you too dearly. And then defense is, okay, maybe you will attack me, but when you come, I'm ready for you. And he says, the problem with defense, well, and then what I'm about to say more concerns conventional forces. So defense is usually conventional forces. Nuclear weapons are not that good for defense. Right? They're no use for defense. They're only good for deterrence. That's what they're really good for. They're not, you're not going to, okay, they're coming across now. Of course, there are tactical nuclear weapons these days, but strategic nuclear weapons, the ones that we're really talking about, you have some sort of an invasion, I don't know, China, should say Canada, right, to keep it light, right? Canada invades us from the north or something, right? At that point, firing nuclear weapons at advancing Canadian forces that's not what they're for. That's not going to work. Again, the strategic ones. But that would be maybe a defense situation. But of course, the idea is, right, that of nuclear weapons is that you've already prevented the attack before it starts by deterring it. So that's the difference between deterrence and defense. But I'm getting into this idea of conventional forces now versus strategic nuclear forces. So you've got conventional forces, which is basically everything else, all the rest of your military, other than the nuclear, strategic nuclear forces. And that's the route we took with Afghanistan. We said, right, you're harboring terrorists, or the Taliban, you're training the training terrorists, we're coming over now. We're going to hold you accountable by removing you from the government and by probably killing a bunch of you and destroying your infrastructure and that sort of thing. So for Ken Waltz, that's possible to do with conventional forces, but with conventional forces, there's too many questions. There's too many questions. There's too many questions to ask. How are they? You can use your conventional forces in many different ways. Nuclear weapon, it's easy. If a nuclear missile's coming towards you, it's going to blow stuff up. That's what it's going to do. It's going to land in a particular place, or it's going to do an airburst, and it's going to, we know the effects straight away. There's no special way to use a nuclear weapon. There's no, other than like the airburst and the land burst. There's a very limited ways to deploy nuclear weapons. Conventional forces, on the other hand, there's a myriad of ways that we're going to use them. So when the United States says we're going to come and we're going to, destroy your infrastructure, well, what does that mean? That could mean different things. And it also, is it airstrikes, right? Targeted airstrikes, is it carpet bombing, right? That's from another era, maybe. Are we talking about a land invasion? And even when we're talking about, let's say, ground forces and a land invasion, is it special forces only? Is it a large scale invasion? What sort of tactics are they going to use? Because all these questions prompt in the mind of an enemy sort of room to think, well, if they do this, we have a response, we could do this. And maybe they'll make a mistake here. Maybe they don't know how to fight in the mountains here. Or maybe these forces that they're sending, they're not really mountain forces, and they're really, if we tactics come into it, right? Tactics come into it, and maybe foreign enemies, or any enemies, I suppose, but maybe in this case, the Taliban, maybe they can look and they can say, we think that we have a strategy that will limit the damage that the conventional forces. The Taliban does not have any tactics that are going to limit the damage of a nuclear weapon. Right? And that's what Ken Waltz is getting at. We're doing the wrong thing in building up conventional forces. We're doing the wrong thing. The conventional forces shouldn't even be. They're not necessary, because nobody's going to invade us if we're ready to. If we understand deterrence and if we understand what we have in nuclear weapons, and if we use them sometimes in limited ways, he suggests, then people won't invade us, and they also won't incur. I'm using invasion because that's the sort of the ultimate encroachment on our interests, but they won't encroach on our sort of dearly held interests, on our very important interests, our vital interests. That's what I think that's the word I was trying to think of. Vital interests. They won't impede on those vital interests because they know what they'll get, and they know exactly how it will be, and they know that they can't prevent it in any way. There's nothing they can do against it. There's no kind of tactic they could use to maybe limit the damage. The damage is going to be severe, and it's going to be real, and it's going to be inevitable. So let me make sure, because I've gone off on a few different paths there to do with nuclear deterrence, but let me make sure I've read the question. In an era of non-state actors, so there is sometimes the attempt to make the non-state actors connected to a state and fighting for causes beyond state sovereignty. I read into that some, if you're prepared to die for your cause, right? I read that extra perhaps part into that. Then it's hard to deter you, right? Which is also valid. How might Waltz rationalize the increase in war between non-nuclear entities, nuclear superpowers? And I think it's fair, and I haven't done this yet, but I think it's fair to, well, I kind of did that at the beginning, but I think it's fair to distinguish between war and terrorism. There's a correlative war index. This is one of many, right, projects, but it's a big project. Actually, when I say one of many, I don't know if I can name any others, but it's one project, and it's one. I suppose what I mean is it's one way to define war. But they do, right? For their purposes, war means that there has to be 1,000 battle deaths. So 1,000 people dying in battle for it to be a war. So there's lots of terrorist attacks, lots of small attacks on civilians, but that's in some ways just a whole other kettle of fish. It's a whole other, and the fact that that's the one that's most prescient to us, that's most at the top of our minds right now is telling, right? I mean, if there was danger or if there was serious conflict going on, leading to a war between superpowers, right, between nation states, I don't know, between Germany and Russia or something like that, that would suddenly become much more the focus of our attention than civil war in Syria or a terrorist attack on the USS Cole or something like that, right? That seems like a different kettle of fish, and the fact that there's an absence of those is maybe since there's Iraq, right? But a marked decrease in interstate warfare, which is a different thing than these other. Are terrorist attacks part of the prolonged peace? And I think the answer is yes. I think Waltz would answer that yes. Of course, even during the Cold War, there were proxy wars and there were scuffles. There was an invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, right? We had a go at Grenada as well. There was conflict. There was fairly serious conflict during the Cold War. But for Waltz, he doesn't see that as, even in the face of that conflict, wars in Africa, right, Angola, in the face of that conflict, he says we're in a prolonged peace, right? So I think in terms of terrorist attacks and that sort of thing, I think he would say yeah, because it's not superpowers going to war against each other. It's also not even states. It's not just superpowers, but it's also any powers, right? Middle powers. If any middle powers gone to war against each other openly. We had sort of Russia versus Georgia a little bit. I think it would be a stretch to call Georgia a middle power. I just mean middle. By middle, I mean people, I suppose, like Turkey, I guess. They're not superpowers, but they're powers, I suppose. Brazil, people like that. India might be on the sort of great power scale, I suppose. Maybe Turkey's not that far away from that either. but you know, maybe, you know, Iran versus Iraq or something like that, or I don't know, Egypt and Libya or something like that. Are we seeing any of those sorts of conflicts? And the answer, I think, is no, unless I'm forgetting something. We are seeing the United States versus Afghanistan. We saw the United States in Iraq a couple of times with Britain and France. You know, that's, as far as I can remember, as close as we've come. And we've had Russia, Georgia as well, which is something. But I think even with those, we've also had actually that, and this is something. This is kind of a counterpoint to Ken Waltz's. You know, if he says, although he would have a comeback as well, but we had the Kargil war between India and Pakistan, two nuclear armed countries. Because of course, the argument that I'm trying to sort of marshal all this into is that, hey, not allow necessarily, but should Iran get nuclear deterrence? Should North Korea develop theirs more fully? Should the United Arab Emirates get it, or Saudi Arabia, or any other country in the world, should they ever obtain a nuclear deterrent? Actually, what we should expect is stability, less spending on conventional forces, less ambiguity as well, right? It should be quite stable, quite clear what people's intentions are and what people's red lines are. We'll take those more seriously. We won't start to think, oh, maybe we have a tactic that would thwart that anyway, so maybe we don't have to take what they're saying seriously. No, we have to take everything seriously now because they've got nuclear weapons. All that leads to sort of this argument that, well, there'll be more stability in the world, less war, less worry about war. And then the counterpoint to all this, the one that I think is the most powerful counterpoint to all this is the Kargil war, where India and Pakistan went to war with each other. It was fairly limited in its scale and in its scope. This is back in the 90s. Man, I don't remember the actual date. Is it 94? Pretty sure it's the 90s though. I'm going to say mid-90s to give myself the largest possible spectrum. I don't know why, but I really want to look this up. The Kargil war, just the date. But the Kargil war was a fairly limited war between the United States and Pakistan. Sorry, did I say United States and Pakistan? Between India and Pakistan. 1999. I was quite a few years off. 1999. Then the Kargil war, 3rd of May, 26th of July, apparently 1999. The Americans. I'm looking now off Wikipedia, but it says India won it easily. I would say so one of the things that happened there, right, is that these are two nuclear armed countries. They're having a direct war with each other. They're shooting at each other. And I think during it, actually, the Pakistanis decide, hey, we don't want, we have a fairly limited nuclear force and we don't want it to be destroyed. We have to hide it. And that they're on they're on trucks, right? Put them on trucks and they say, okay, go into the northwest frontier province. Right, which of course, if you know about Pakistan, right, is the least stable place in Pakistan. It's the place where the government has the least control and where where armed bands of men are sort of roaming around, owning the place, right? So that might not be the best place to put your nuclear weapons. But Bill Clinton at the time, pretty sure it was Bill Clinton, 1999, certainly would have been. Bill Clinton says, hey, we've got to stop this, right? And de-escalates the war straight away because he sees the potential for a war between two nuclear armed states. That could be a counterpoint, right? Because, hey, you promised us stability, but these countries are going to war with each other. And then I guess in my defense, or in Ken Waltz's defense, hey, it was a very limited war that, because they were nuclear armed, the United States jumped in very quickly, put a stop to it in ways that they may not have done in other circumstances, right? So again, that's another argument for stability. Okay, I've spent all that time on one question, and actually a lot of this answer is going to apply to the rest of the questions. So let me Let me though let me apply those things. The country enjoying a momentary defensive advantage will be tempted to strike in the forlorn hope that its defences will be able to handle a ragged and reduced response to its first strike. Both countries would prepare to launch on warning, while obviously weighing the balance between offensive and defensive forces. What are some lessons that we could take historically from the Cold War to prepare or avoid for possible threats? This, I think, was the second most popular question. I think the quote is really a moment where Waltz is hammering home this message about conventional forces, or defense versus deterrence, where, again, which we've already said this, and so I'll just restate it and we'll move on, but defense, it's more of a gray area because there's more inclination to misjudge the capabilities of conventional forces, and also to believe that either their tactics are going to be inferior to yours, and so you'll have an advantage, or that your tactics are inferior, and so you'll superior, and so you'll have an advantage, which I suppose is maybe the same thing. But yeah, it leads to miscalculation. When we're relying on conventional forces, when we're relying on defense, we miscalculate. That, and miscalculation is one of the biggest causes of wars between states, miscalculation. I think I'm more powerful than you are. You think you're more powerful than I am. All right, let's find out. When it comes to nuclear weapons, there's much less scope for miscalculation. Nuclear weapons do one thing, and they do it in such a way that you can't stop it from doing it, whatever your tactics are, is Ken Waltz's argument. And then finally, third most popular question, deterrence in its pure form, this is the quote, deterrence in its pure form entails no ability to defend. Yeah. A deterrent strategy promises not to fend off an aggressor, but to damage or destroy things the aggressor holds dear. This is a big part of his argument here. You've tapped into there. No ability to defend, which, I mean, the most extreme position to take here is, look, we don't need conventional forces anymore. We have nuclear weapons. That makes them obsolete. There's nothing to defend anymore. There's no need to defend anything anymore, because we just have to say, we've got nuclear weapons, we will launch them. And again, right, if it's a lower level, thinkers, you'll say, well, that's not credible. We're not going to have all-out nuclear war over something like, you know, the Iranians have impounded another British ship or something. Right now, the British are not going to launch a nuclear war over that. Yeah, they're not. They're not going to want to do that. But and I think they did almost nothing about it. So it might not rise to this level at all. But if it did rise to the level where they might actually use a nuclear missile, a limited one, very limited one, the most limited, in a particular area, just to say, look, that was a red line for us. That was you shouldn't have done that. That, for Ken Waltz, would lead to the immediate backing down of Iran, or any other country, even a nuclear armed country. Let's say Iran was nuclear armed. That's pretty radical. And so because of that, what's the need for conventional forces? If we say we have conventional forces to defend ourselves, well, we've already got nuclear weapons that do that perfectly, or very powerfully, more powerfully than conventional forces could. Do you believe that reason nations seek to improve? Okay, here we go. Do you believe, this is the question here, I haven't even got to the question. Do you believe the reason nations seek to improve their nuclear weapons is to possibly destroy an aggressor instead of wanting to improve in order to scare possible aggressors? How is that strategy better? How do you think nuclear treaties affect nations? This is the second question now. How do you think nuclear treaties affect nations' dependence on nuclear weapons versus non-dependence? And I think nuclear treaties, there's a couple of them, right? There's a couple of big ones. One is like a strategic reduction. Treaties that the US and the Soviet Union had through the Cold War, and still they're still in place, right? To say, look, we've got tons of nuclear weapons here. This is quite expensive, and we don't want it to get lost behind the back of the sofa or something, get into the wrong hands. So let's both agree just to reduce them. We don't need so many. Remember, Ken Waltz says you don't need a lot. You need. It's not even about numbers, really. It's about, do you have a second strike capability, and is that, would the second strike be so damaging that it would be so costly for the initial country to launch the attack that they wouldn't think about it, right? So that's the deterrence side of things, right? And so and that's also the let's reduce the numbers that we have, and that's been fairly successful, mostly because it doesn't really matter how many you have after some certain point. It matters if you only have one, right? Because if it gets blown up, then you have no second strike capability. Unless you're really good at hiding it, like putting it in the northwest frontier province or something. But let's say we then have the alternative here is this we're being sort of asked to decide between these two alternative strategies. One is this to deter, right? What is it? Instead of wanting to improve in order to scare possible, deterrence is about fear. Right? It's about fear of the consequences of our actions. We're not going to make those actions. We're not going to do that thing. We're not going to make that attack. We're not going to pursue that policy, because if we do, we're scared that we're going to get severely injured by nuclear weapons. Maybe we don't believe that they'll annihilate our country if we follow this policy, right? If maybe we don't annihilate Iran if it invades Kuwait, but maybe we strike it very hard, right, with nuclear weapons in such a way that it would be very costly to them. So that's the one, and that's certainly what Ken Waltz is saying. The other one, right, is, do you believe, well, could we do it well, the more I read it now and the more I think about it, where I just went out to answer it, I might be reading something more into the question than's really there. Because if we're improving our nuclear weapons to possibly destroy an aggressor, that is sort of part of the fear, right? That threat, that ability to destroy an aggressor is an important part of deterrence. It's not the willingness to do it. We don't want to do it. And the likelihood is, if it's effective, we won't do it. Which is why deterrence is complicated. Because one of the things that sometimes people say that Ken Waltz is arguing against is, oh, you wouldn't really do that. You wouldn't really launch a nuclear attack. And the answer is kind of yes, right? At the beginning, he talks about how monstrous it would be, right? Critics of nuclear deterrence say, look, it'd be so monstrous to destroy a whole country and to destroy the world. Nobody would ever do it, and so then it lacks credibility. And that is a complication, right? And then Ken Waltz has to say something like, look, it's not the doing it that's the thing. It's the fear that it could be. It's the possibility, it's the potential. That's the real effect here. That's the real tool here, is the fear. So it could be that we could sort of meld these into two and say, look, the fact that we can possibly destroy an aggressor, that is important as part of the fear. And so we would say we're going to have both of these. If we wanted to, if we said no, are they really not wanting to destroy an aggressor, but actually they want to use it for some sort of advantage, some sort of a gain, some sort of we're going to like strategically launch a nuclear attack in order to gain something. That Ken Waltz goes into that too, right? He definitely disagrees that is likely. So he says for that to happen, and he picks on somebody who argued this point. I forget his name. It's too close to Nietzsche for me to remember the name. It's not Nietzsche, obviously. It's Nietzsche or something. But anyway, he's arguing with Nietzsche, and he's saying, because Nietzsche says, well, look, what if the Soviet Union launched a first strike on the United States? What if they destroyed a lot of the nuclear weapons, but only their only military force of the United States, right? So then the strike, it's not like they're not launching strikes against New York or Los Angeles or anything like that. They're just striking military targets, but they destroy a whole bunch of the US military. Now, says Ken Waltz's interlocutor, Nietzsche, I think it is. Now he says, now the US president is faced with this decision now of, shall we enter now into a nuclear war with the Soviet Union? Shall we counter-strike, and make them pay? Knowing then that escalates an already very escalated situation. And Nietzsche says, no, the president could very well say, look, it's only military targets. They've attacked military targets, and they've weakened us to the point where we don't have that many left to respond with now. They've taken a lot of our forces out, and so I'm not sure I'm not sure that we should retaliate. So Ken Waltz says no. So this would be an example of what you're saying. Well, what I'm sort of reading into what you're saying. One state, the Soviet Union, using a nuclear strike to advance itself militarily or strategically. And so that's the way that Needs thinks it would work. Ken Waltz says, no, actually the fact that they might destroy a lot of the nuclear weapons isn't the issue. We'd still have, even if we had 20 left, right, that's already the damage that 20 nuclear weapons, modern nuclear weapons, could do to the Soviet Union is unacceptable damage that there would not be. The other thing that I thought was even, it was newer for me, I guess, so maybe, but more. He says, look, this isn't fair, right? Because you're endowing the United States government with a lot of circumspection, with a lot of hesitancy to use nuclear weapons, an incredible amount of hesitancy to use them in retaliation. But you're not doing that for the Soviets. Somehow and he says this is a common thing that strategists do, that senior foreign policy people do. Military policy, strategic policy, they think that those guys are so different from us, right, that they wouldn't be hesitant to use nuclear weapons. You know, we're hesitant to use them in a second strike situation after we've already been attacked. But they're not even hesitant to use them as a first strike, right? And so Ken Waltz says there's something about nuclear weapons, the quality of them, he says this early on, but the quality of nuclear weapons is so different that to contemplate using them in a first strike situation to get some sort of military or strategic advantage like that is just, you know, we wouldn't think that we would do it. Nobody else would do it either, right? Nobody would do it. The risks are too great. The consequences are too expensive. And so if we would be hesitant to use them, so would they. So would anybody else. So would the Iranian. And so he doesn't say Iran, right, because this is a long time before now, but the Iranians would be as well, right, for the same reason. The North Koreans would be for the same reason. The Chinese would be. Of course, there was, he makes this point in another reading that you could no doubt find later on. If you look up Ken Waltz, nuclear deterrence, he has a lot of this. He's been arguing this for a long time. And if you look at Waltz and Scott Sagan, they have a book together that goes backwards and forwards. Scott Sagan takes the other side of this, which I suppose would have been a good one to read. There's a lot of things on this that would be really good to read, and so sort of a line at some point. But yeah, if you read their debates, they've had just a couple of debates in person, but they've also written this book together where they debate it in the book. It goes backwards and forwards, but Ken Waltz certainly is making the point here, and it's because it's the more unusual point, I think, from a media standpoint. That's the one that I wanted you to see, that nuclear weapons, they lead to stability, and so they also could lead to cost reductions in conventional forces. So there, have a look at that. Hopefully that's answered some of the questions in an interesting way. Hopefully it takes you back to Ken Waltz's article. Hopefully it takes you on maybe to some of the books and things. Maybe this is something that you become interested in and you know, study further. But that's the end of my video for today, and I'm going to find the end meeting button. All right, see you later.